Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think I came to the EBD to give a seminar just the year I finished my PhD in 2003 when the center was somewhere else. I haven't come since. I haven't even given any other seminar in Spain, so this is my second seminar in a very different position. So I thought I'll give you first an overview of what my group is doing now. I'm always interested in starting new collaborations, so if there's somebody with similar affinities, you can come to talk to me afterwards. This nice drawing was done by a student of mine and now stays as the logo or the capture for the web page. And it has in orange some of the species or places we work with empirically. Then we have a lot of work that is macro scale, global, or at the European level and so on. And it's a little bit outdated for the field part too. Anyway, I define myself as a conservation scientist, rather holistic and integrative. But my training started as a field ecologist, moved to be a theoretical ecologist, did my PhD with an engineer in computing science and optimization tools. But I started missing the ecology again. And now as a conservation scientist, I'm trying to bridge all the theoretical aspects and conceptual aspects I've brought during all this time, but very much going back to the field and trying to do things that have real implications on the ground. So this is the core of what we do. And I try to have research in all the major big threats of biodiversity. Climate change is the one that has perhaps longest history, and you could detect it more from my list of publications, and that stemmed from the work I did as a Ramonica Hall at the museum with Miguel Araujo. But I think that most of the work we are doing now in tropical countries relates to habitat loss, especially Amazon, Madagascar, and East Africa. We do work a bit with overexploitation, and you might remember Erin Cameron. She was visiting here. She's working with invasive species, and now we are trying to bring the interactions between invasive species and climate change. My PhD was on conservation planning. That's optimal, or software for optimal reserve planning when resources are limited. But now, more and more, I'm working on what I call conservation effectiveness, to try to understand what works and what doesn't work. We have a lot of protected areas. We seem to want more, but are the ones that we have working? Or are the management that we are doing correct, and so on? But in order to address that, I think we cannot separate the ecology from the sociopolitical context. We need to understand where is this conservation happening? What are the drivers? What are the stressors? What are the reactions? So I brought quite a lot of social science to the team, and I am very, very happy of this interaction. We have two postdocs that have a strong social science background and a couple of PhD students. And this integration is becoming more and more natural, and now we are looking more into bringing concepts of ecology to social sciences to try to make our sampling methods or sampling designs more compatible or more believable across sciences. So this is more or less the people in my team. Some are missing. There's one branch of the team that is missing, and it's the one that is directed by one of the semi-independent postdocs and her 3 students, and the new PhD students are lacking. But today I thought of concentrating on climate change because the most recent publications and recent history links to that, and all the other work is still under process and very initial. Anyway, just to say that we work with individual species, we work with communities, we work with taxonomic richness, phylogenetical diversity, we work at functional aspects of conservation effectiveness, ecosystem services, and the other aspect of conservation, which is human well-being. And this is not just the basic ecosystem services, but just well-being per se. Are the communities living next to protected areas getting something? Are they feeling well by having protected areas next by? But to the topic of this talk, conservation in the face of climate change. You might have heard of this analogy often posed by Jared Diamond of the Edel Quartet, referring to the 4 main drivers of biodiversity loss. At that time, Jared Diamond was referring to overexploitation, invasive habitat loss, and secondary extinctions. But Corey Bradshaw and others have called for an update of this picture, at least this analogy, saying that we need to call call them the evil quintet or sextet because climate change has come to the picture. Climate change is becoming more and more of a threat. It's becoming one of the dominant threats of biodiversity, and climate change interacting with these other stresses may have unprecedented impacts on biodiversity. So what I want to do in this talk is to start by maybe reviewing, briefly going through what do we know about climate change, what are the current impacts, and how can we predict the impacts. And I'm going to keep it short because I know that you have had some seminars this week that may have touched upon some of these. Then I will move to talk about conservation strategies, and then about cross-sectoral synergies and trade-offs. And that's because I think that as a response to climate change, in all other societal sectors, we are having indirect impacts on biodiversity. Yeah, so let's leave it out so we can go faster. So I start with what do we know? And just very briefly, this is not my own work, so I'll keep it just short. What happens when we have climate change? If you look at it spatially across species occurrence, imagine that this circle is the distribution of the species. It basically represents a set of environmental conditions or climate conditions where the species is adapted to. When you have climate change, this set of climatic conditions changes in space, either shrinks or expands or moves, or disappears completely. Species have different strategies to go about it. They can decide to stay and try to cope with the changes. They can move with the climate. They can go extinct. And there's a number of factors that determine what the species will do, besides contingencies. Some species are more tolerant than others. Others have more adaptive ability to changing conditions, have been exposed to variation before. Some are more abundant than others and therefore can stand variation. Some are more mobile and can track climate change, others are not. And then we have genetic diversity and possibility for evolution. If we look at the evidence, most of the evidence comes from moves. Also, when you look at the paleontological record, it seems that species like to track climate. They just don't stay and adapt. They just don't disappear. If they can, they will track climate. They will move in space, and they will conserve this climatic envelope. But the first evidence that we had for climate change were very much phenological changes, that is, advances in the seasonality. Plants flowering earlier, migrant birds arriving earlier, and so on and so forth. These are usually very local adaptations, and I call them short-term adaptations because first you have this response, and whenever this doesn't match with the system, either you have extinctions or then these advancements allow the species to be more abundant in localities and then therefore start moving forward. In terms of extinctions, if you look at full species extinctions, we have very few that are attributable to climate change. Some amphibians, but it's been debatable whether it's climate change per se or it's the interaction of climate change and a disease. But we do have quite a lot of local extinctions attributable to climate change at low elevations and what we call the trailing edge. When the climate space is moving, the populations that are left behind are starting to go extinct. But certainly, the greatest evidence that we have nowadays is evidence for geographical shifts. Species are moving. If we look 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, we see that most of the species are not anymore in the places where they used to be. And if we correlate this to climate change, it seems that species are following the climate. From a number of reviews, it seems that overall species are moving close to 20 kilometers per decade, but some species or taxa are moving hundreds of kilometers in 10 years. And these changes are happening also in elevation. Yet it seems that these shifts are not being fast enough if we compare to the speed at which climate is changing. So the movements of the species are smaller than the movements of the observed temperature changes. And I don't have any of my own results for this part, but just to tell you that we are working on observed impacts. For Finnish birds, we have data for the past 50 years, and we are analyzing 3 consecutive atlases. We are looking at Madagascar herpetofauna changes in elevational gradient, and also we are working with savanna vertebrates, especially mammals, to see whether the changes in these are due to recent human activities or certainly to climate change. And then we have a couple of long-term experiments going on with earthworms and with macroalgae. But let's move to the core of what I've been doing maybe the last 7 years or so, and that's trying to predict or trying to model what's happening with climate change. If you have followed a bit the literature, and probably many of you are doing these things, the most current or the most common way of modeling impacts is by what we call bioclimatic envelope models or species distribution models, niche models. They have many names. This is the big bulk of the literature. If you look at climate change and biodiversity literature, everybody's doing bioclimatic envelope models. But there's many other ways of modeling climate change. One reason why these are preferred is because they don't need much data. Basically, they need climatic layers, which are available for all the world, and they need species occurrences, either presence or presence absence. And there is a lot of software available, very easy to run. You just have your species, your climate, you correlate them, and there you go. But there's been recently some attempts to go both ways, to try to simplify things going with less data and to try to go more complex. In this other extreme, we have what we call process-based or mechanistic approaches. In these ones, you may have very complex models that include demography, they include dispersal, they include physiology. And they model the tiny things very locally and then go bigger and see how species are going to respond to climate change. Obviously, these are very data hungry, and you cannot do this for a large number of species. So this is mostly done for plant functional types, big groups of species, especially plants. And my student Antti has been comparing, for example, plant models based on DEMS and mechanistic models. Then we seem to have a lot of interest in doing what we call hybrid models. These are still requiring little data, but go more to the mechanistic side. Some of these hybrid models use one of these models as a background to create the suitability area, and then they may put some demography afterwards to see whether the species will reach there. Or they use what we call species traits to filter the exposure, which are the species that are really going to respond or are more vulnerable or not. So I have Raquel and Maria, two PhD students that finished already, did work on these hybrid models. But what Raquel did also was to go to the other extreme. Depending on the areas of the world you're working, you don't even have enough data from species occurrence that you can tell something about what's going to happen with climate change. And usually it's the most rich and diverse areas of the world that are like that, and we would like to be able to say something of what's going to happen with climate change. So she started looking into what we call climate metrics, which is basically using only climate data to tell something about the potential impacts on biodiversity. And I start by explaining a little bit some of these outcomes. Basically, when you look at the literature of climate change and you look at use of climate metrics in order to say something for species, the most common metric used is basically climate anomalies, temperature increase, if you will. Some of them may measure change in area, predicted change in area of particular climate. But climate is the most, climate change in terms of locally, how much that's going to heat up or cool down is the metric mostly used. But there's many others. There's local metrics, there are regional metrics. There's things like how fast it's going to change, or how far the same climate is going to move to, how much it's going to expand or contract, or are we going to have novel climates, things that we haven't had before. So if you separate all these and you map them, basically this is one of the maps of climates of the world. So if you see how these climates are going to change according to different metrics, you would be highlighting very different parts of the world. The poles or the Arctic region, which is often highlighted by climate change, peaks up there with area. That's basically because that's a region that is probably going to disappear per se as a climate. It's going to contract. So it has a big change in area, but it doesn't have bigger changes in all the other metrics. If you look at the tropics, the red line, that usually they're claimed to be pretty safe and pretty stable and so on and so forth. We have two alarming things here. One, it's novel climates there, which are going to increase, and there's going to be a big share of the tropics that are going to have new climates. And then you have extreme events, a higher frequency of extreme events. These two things are very uncertain, which bring new challenges for conservation. We are going to have the tropics with a lot of species, high diversity, and then two new changes of climate change, novel climates, extreme events that are going to make the conservation business in that area very uncertain. So what we did in this paper that appeared in Science last year was to try to review what can you do once you have these metrics, and if you know what kind of species you have in your locality, or you know where you are, how should you adapt? How you should prepare for this or that, depending if the species that are target species for you are having low mobility, or are amphibians that are very little tolerant to changes in precipitation, or are they so you can classify and have rules of thumb for whether to act one way or another. The other interesting thing that Raquel did was to compare these metrics to the bioclimatic envelope model projections for one region, and we found surprisingly good match qualitatively, saying that the same regions would be highlighted by bioclimatic envelope models than for many species, than by metrics using known species at all. So it's a positive avenue, but we have done that only for one region, and we are not sure whether this can be extrapolated to others. Note of caution there. Going back to bioclimatic envelope models, I don't know how familiar you are with them, but one of the things that has been more out there in the debate is whether they are too uncertain. And there's different aspects of uncertainty that they carry. Obviously, they don't take any ecology or any physiology or anything, it's just a species occurrence, so all the processes are not there. But there's one type of uncertainty that is the model uncertainty, which is huge. The way you do these models is, well, it's diverse. You have, for instance, most of the common approaches nowadays are using 7 to 9 different modeling tools that do different assumptions that fit, some more linear, some less linear, some are black boxes, some are neural networks, some are trees. So you have all these different statistical tools to produce a model. If you compare the outcomes of these different ways of modeling, you get completely different results. You get very different projections. So what Raquel was doing, she was concerned because there's been a lot of speculation in the climatological circles that global circulation models are uncertain, and there's up to 20 global circulation models, and they offer some variation, and climatologists are always very careful, and they want to portray this uncertainty. And she was wondering whether the uncertainty in bioclimatic models, bioclimatic envelope models, is bigger than the global circulation models. So with projections for amphibians, snakes, mammals, and birds in Africa, she partitioned that uncertainty. So she looked at the combinations of different climate change models, different envelope models, different climate change scenarios, and then she looked at what share of that variation is bigger with bioclimatic envelope models, or with global circulation models, or with climate change scenarios. And I think it's pretty alarming. You find the red ones, which means that bioclimatic envelope models have a big share of all that uncertainty, as high as 75 to 100% in all the orange and reds. And if you look at the global circulation models, it's mostly blue, saying that basically you can omit the uncertainty of global circulation models when you're looking at the impacts on biodiversity, because we have more uncertainty on the second phase of the modeling. Interestingly, if you look at the climate change scenarios, whether the wall is going to heat up 2 degrees or 4 degrees, we're going to have a greener or a more global wall, you can see difference here in the uncertainty, meaning that at the end of the century, you always have more uncertainty carried by these, because the trajectories diverge. You have different models there. But anyway, since this work, there's been more caution in the use of bioclimatic envelope models, and more calls for the use of multiple models, what we call ensembles of models, before making some decisions. You shouldn't, if you do a paper with a single modeling approach, it's not going to be accepted anymore. You need to include a few and at least do a sensitivity analysis, or do what many are doing, which is consensus, try to average your models or try to use an approach that synthesizes all this information. So besides the step of building models, what we are interested in is to apply them to conservation questions. One of the first works we did when I was at Ramon y Cajal in the museum was to look at the fate of protected areas if we use this kind of ensemble models, multiple models, to see what's going to happen to the species in the protected areas in Europe. And basically the blue here tells a very doomed message, saying that all those grid cells have protected areas with the species that are there for which the climatic space is going to get worse. So all these blue areas are going to have more loser species than winner species. There's only a few green areas in Europe, which is basically high elevation areas, Alps and Pyrenees, and then northern Scandinavia or Fennoscandia. But it's a bit of an artifact. I think the message there is a bit wrong, because the reason why they are green is that currently they have a lot of marginal species or common species that are there, for which their climatic suitability is going to get even better. But for the species that are cold adapted, the typical species of these environments, the situation is not going to be that good, and you have much more blue in this map. If you look at the warm adapted species of these areas, you see that green is very much there, but not for the typical cold species. I think that the situation is going to be very poor. This other study is from Finland. Probably you don't know Finland very much. So this is the map of Finland. And it has a very strong climatic gradient with Arctic here, boreal or hemiboreal in the south, and the sea is around here, but actually up to there. And the polygons that you see, or the shapes you see there, are protected areas. So the distribution of protected areas is very polarized. You have continuous, very large protected areas in the Arctic or subarctic zone, and you have lots of very tiny protected areas in the south. If you would do conservation assessments now, and you would do what many people are doing, which is called gap analysis, that's basically put your protected areas on top of your diversity distribution and see which are the species that are well covered and which are the ones that are poorly covered. If you look at this here, we have, well, this is target achieved, but it could be understood as how much of their area is protected. So the more we go to that direction, more coverage, less coverage. We can see all these red dots here. Each dot is a species. These are the northern species, species that can be defined by having a center of the distribution in the north. They are all very well covered. The blue species are the ones that are poorly covered or less well covered. But if we match that with actually population trends, we see the opposite pattern. The species that apparently are better protected, all their distribution is covered in protected areas. They're having negative population trends. If you look at those that have very little protection in protected areas, they are having positive population trends. So this is certainly a sign of climate impacting, this was for birds actually, impacting these populations, and also a warning note that protected areas cannot stop all threats. They cannot stop climate change. You cannot do anything, even if you have a protected area there and climate comes through. We're going to probably lose these red species there. There's nothing we can do. And actually, we were working also on doing species distribution or bioclimatic envelope models for these species, and we have confirmed that the species for which contractions are projected are those with declining population trends. Okay, so moving to the more hybrid models, which is using bioclimatic envelope models with traits. This is a way of filtering your uncertainty. So you could consider a bioclimatic envelope model as a way of measuring the exposure to coming climate change. It's not a realization, it's not a prediction of where exactly the species is going to be, but it's saying that the species is going to be very exposed in these areas. And if you do that, you come up with these maps highlighting in dark shades areas that are going to have large number of species that are going to be exposed or potentially impacted by climate change. But not all species are equally vulnerable. So if you start looking at species traits that can tell you something about the vulnerability of species, you can take away some of this uncertainty and focus on different management actions in different areas, or be prepared differently in different areas. For example, we have databases on temperature tolerance traits, for amphibians, and we know that particularly this area that was highlighted here has a lot of species of low tolerance, or precipitation tolerance down there, or species that depend on particular cues. And this is important for amphibians that need at least, I don't know, a minimum of rainy days or a minimum of ponds to be able to reproduce and things like that. So if you were a manager in these different areas, you would know what to do, perhaps, or at least you would focus on this particular species. But if you just look this map here, you might not be able to tell much, and you would be able to spot some areas, especially down here in the coast, that seem alarming, but when you look at the vulnerability, there doesn't seem to be anything especially vulnerable, so those might not be priorities. And Maria Trevino, a former student of mine, did a similar study for Iberian Peninsula birds, where she combined this potential exposure from bioclimatic envelope models to what she called the potential vulnerability. And here she used a combination of these life history traits together with threatened status by the red list, meaning that if you're a species that is very threatened right now, you're probably also more vulnerable to additional stressors. And I think that what came out of Maria's study was surprisingly positive. If you look at this potential exposure, meaning that the upper quadrants are the ones that are going to be more exposed to climate change, those are species that are susceptible to climate change, and you separate the ones that are vulnerable to those that are not, you see that actually there's just a few species that are going to be double jeopardized. Only few of the threatened species nowadays are also going to be impacted by climate change. Whether there's a lot of species that are going to be exposed to climate change, but perhaps they are not so vulnerable. So if we move to conservation strategies, there's been already quite a lot of, how can I say, dialogue or propositions of what should we do to deal with climate change in the conservation sector. Most of it is more of the same. There's no new tools or new recommendations. We just have the same tools for conservation. Maybe their spatial location is slightly different. But basically, we can separate these different tools as establishing new protected areas to accommodate shifts, to include more environmental heterogeneity, and to include both the core of the distribution and the margin of the distribution. We could improve existing networks by improving connectivity and allowing species to move from one to the other. We could increase flexibility, and that's a tricky one, but basically improve adaptive management plans with proper planning and monitoring so that we can adapt as we see changes. We can have movable protected areas, areas that are not fixed, that after some time you can degazette and then place them elsewhere. This somehow happens especially with bird nesting or with things like that, that we have things, regulations that are short time and move on. And we could include more management of disturbance regimes. And the last ones, perhaps more typical of climate change, are what's called assisted migration, which is the reinvention of the translocation practices. Basically, that's bringing species in areas that we know they are contracting to areas that we know are going to be far away but suitable. Are we moving, or should we move them there is another question. I'm not very in favor of this, but I think that this has captured the attention of many conservation scientists working with climate change. So as a conservation planner and somebody that likes building software to design protected areas, given that we have limited resources, we of course started looking at that, and there's different approaches you could build, but basically most of these conservation planning approaches try to capture part of the present, part of the future, and some of the in-between areas. So we try to look more into the future when planning. Basically, these would be areas that are the redder one, more important in the present, areas that are more important in particular scenarios. This is just for one species. And then we have what we call, sources and stepping stones, areas that are going to be sending out populations to the future cores and areas that are going to be receiving. And we can put all these, I'm not going to talk about equations or models or anything, but in optimization softwares to try to optimize the areas that we take, that with a minimum number of resources we can have it all. And then we can reclassify the areas that we get. This is for European amphibians and reptiles. And we can reclassify them according to their importance as future cores or present cores, sources, and stepping stones. This was, again, my former PhD student. Something we learned with this project, and I think it's the most important take-home message, is that conservation is about trade-offs, and that the future is, unfortunately, more uncertain than the present. So what most of the researchers that were working with climate change were trying to protect both the present or the future. We were not thinking whether this is the right way to go, because we don't know much about the future. I show you how uncertain it is with all the projections we have. Should we be giving equal weight to the future as to the present? No politician is going to buy it. Nobody's going to want to protect something that is not relevant for the present. Can we do better? How can we account for this uncertainty? I think that going for the future has nothing wrong as long as it doesn't compromise the present. So what we were doing for this analysis is to try to build this cost-benefit curves and see if we protect more of the future, how much we are compromising of the present protection. And basically, this is what these lines are telling you. There is obviously some future protected if you just protect the present. But basically, if you're here, you start equal with the two lines. And when you give more weight to the future, the gain for the future distributions protected is quite steep. But then you have here the loss for the present. At the beginning, you don't lose much. You lose a little bit of coverage for some species here and there. But then start to increase linearly. This is for a particular scenario and for particular data, but you could have these curves crossing or going millions of ways. And what I think is interesting is to look at the difference. For example, in this point of inflection here, you know that for little loss of the present, you have quite a lot of gain of the future. How much of the present are you willing to compromise is another question, but you could look at these curves before making decisions of giving equal weight to future than to present. Or you could do another thing that many people are doing and saying, I want to go for more robust solutions and go to protect these areas that are valuable in the present that are also projected to be valuable in the future. I don't want to go to protect areas that are not valuable today and maybe are good for the future of some species, but go to those areas that are important today and that are going to be especially important as retention areas. Areas of species that are projected to be contracting in other places, areas that will remain as refuge. And looking at this strategy, we did an assessment of European funding that's using the solidarity funds or cohesion funds and the Life Plus programs and so on to see where is Europe putting the investments and is that aligned with climate change. Not that it should, but perhaps we should start thinking about it. Should we start thinking of the ways funding is allocated in Europe if we need to adapt? Because that's what other sectors are doing. There is a lot of investment in developing the energy sector, the water sector, agricultural sector, and climate change is everywhere at the European level. So should we be doing that for biodiversity? Does the LIFE program, the cohesion funds, has to be looking into future or not? Basically what we find is that they are very poorly aligned. They are somehow aligned with current priorities or with current Natura 2000 areas. Basically, regions with more Natura 2000 areas receive more funding. That's a basic conclusion from that. If you look at the map, this is only a ranking, so I'm not going to say that this is the final graph, but basically there's a polarization that makes sense with climate change. Everything that is green are areas that are more or less receiving decent funding for the biodiversity they have in the future, or their priorities in the future. Everything that is below with these colors, they are receiving substantially more funding than what they should, given their priority in the future. Areas in reds and yellows, these are areas that are going to become more important in the future, and that are not receiving cohesion funding. I wouldn't tell European decision makers that they should allocate funds based on this, not at all, but that these considerations should be on the table, that we should be looking a bit more to the future if we have to adapt, because it's obvious that there's going to be a north-south polarization, that areas in the south have been very important for their biodiversity in the past in Europe, but the north is going to be receiving a lot of species. There's not much funding going to support that. There's quite a lot of uncertainty of what's going to happen around here because we don't have much data from the other side. Something else we've done, as I said, I work quite a lot in this policy social science interface, is to look at the match between impacts that have been reported, adaptation strategies that have been called for, and how ready the European policy is to accommodate this. And basically, we can see that most of the strategies that have been suggested, whether it's more numbers of reserves or connectivity or movable protected areas, management, and so on, they basically all deal with shifts, which is okay. It's the most common pattern that we observe. But there's very little looking at these aspects of functional changes in ecosystems, community changes, species interactions, and so on. Everything is very much looking at individual species changing places. If you look at the policy side, it's a bit more complex. You can interpret the law many ways. So in theory, the habitat directives could support more reserves, could support increased connectivity, could support movable areas. Whether it's doing so, it's a different thing, because many of the recommendations are non-binding. Member states don't have the obligation to do that. It's just recommendable that you keep a suitable state of your species, and that's it. So what we were calling for is perhaps a revision of the directives, perhaps more binding recommendations, or at least more awareness of that. And I will finish with what we call the cross-sectoral synergies. And as I said at the beginning, everything that is happening in the other sectors, which is happening fast, is having effects on biodiversity. And these are indirect effects of climate change that we are disregarding. There's developments in the energy sector, a lot of going into bioenergy. There is a lot of developments in transport, power line creations, and so on. All this has impacts on biodiversity. There's development in the water sector, dams being built everywhere, contention dams or coastal protections. All this has impact on biodiversity, and it's a consequence of climate change adaptation. So what we've been saying is that climate change research for biodiversity should include a link to what's happening in other sectors. And it's not enough that you look at what's going to happen to the species if the temperature increases. It's like, what are all the other developments that are happening as a consequence if we have a 2-degree wall or a 4-degree wall? As a first attempt, in one of the first European projects I was in, this was in Maquis, we tried to map some of these potential interactions. And this is only qualitative, very vague, and not very trustable, but I think it raised some debate and it gave food for thought. But basically, here you have different strategies that are coming as a response to climate change. Some are more what we call mitigation actions, actions to reduce climate change. Others are adaptations in whatever sector. And here is what we call whatever it has a positive effect on biodiversity or a negative. And basically, the errors are kind of an estimate of the uncertainty, because some actions could be very positive or very negative depending on how they are implemented. So we could improve in recommendations. Where we want to go is these win-win-win situations. We want to have actions that can both mitigate and adapt and are positive for biodiversity. I think it's a bit naive to think that we could do that for all the sectors, but as much as we can, we should try to go to this direction. And it's obvious that forest conservation is something that improves mitigation or keeps mitigation, helps adapt for, depending what we're looking at, and is benefiting for biodiversity. And then we have urban tree planting or green rooftops and so on. But then we have things like dams, seawall defense that are very much on the negative side, and they have very little popular alternatives that might be more positive. And then we have things like biofuels or bioenergy, which is very debated. So in an attempt to try to quantify some of these, we went to the bioenergy comparison. And what we wanted to compare is, would it be better to have a much warmer wall or a slightly warmer wall with bioenergy? Are the consequences of bioenergy to habitat loss more detrimental for biodiversity than a much warmer world without bioenergy? Which is not an obvious thing to do, and nobody was looking at these kind of things before. So I was hoping that there would be very drastic results, and we could say, yes, let's go for the 2-degree wall, and it doesn't matter how much bioenergy we have, it's still better for biodiversity. We were able to do this only for birds, so I wouldn't say that this is the final answer. We were using integrative assessment models, which model changes in land cover types integrated with the energy sector to see how much energy goes into the system and how much emissions and so on and so forth. And basically in red, you have the changes in land cover in a 4-degree wall, in a 4-degree warmer wall, and the blue one is in a 2-degree warmer wall. You can see that changes are not big for some of the biomes or the types of land covers and so on, but if you look at bioenergy, basically the 4-degree wall stays the same, the 2-degree wall increases a lot the land cover that goes into bioenergy. And there are some differences in abandoned forest or regrowth and temperate deciduous forests, but not much more in the others. So if you look at this as habitat loss paired with climate change for the 2-degree and climate change only for the 4-degree, what are the consequences for European birds? And this graph, unfortunately, is not very good to look at the changes, but if you believe me, I can tell you that there is indeed more negative consequences in the warmer wall. So overall, we have contractions of about 40% in that scenario, where we have contractions of 28% in the 2-degree wall with bioenergy. So it seems that bioenergy mitigates climate change and reduces the contractions for species. But that was not good news for all species, and we had some species, at least 7, for which the positive impacts of reducing climate were counteracted by the habitat loss. So if we would look only at the climate, we could tell that these species are going to be doing well, but when we put the climate plus the loss of the habitat due to energy, these species were doing very poorly. A note of precaution, though, and this is something I really like to pursue, is that for this study, this was modeling the energy needs for Europe and was modeling the land cover changes in Europe. But note that 40 to 50% of the bioenergy needs of Europe are imported. That means that most of the impact of bioenergy is outside Europe, and we are not measuring that. So if all the bioenergy is imported from Indonesia or from Southeast Asia, what's the impact there? And we are, at the moment, being blind to that. And I'd love to do a study that is looking more into that direction. Anyway, I reached the end. So some concluding remarks. Definitely the impacts of climate change are observable nowadays. So yes, I believe in climate change. And the projections are quite darning. We have a big tool set for predicting impacts, and lots of work is going into improving these models in making them more mechanistic and more credible and less uncertain. There is promotion of using multiple model approaches to reduce uncertainty, but still very little bridges between the developments in that field towards conservation. What should we do with that uncertainty? How can we manage it? Conservation planning or tools for conservation planning have been developed quickly following the changes in the field. I think that now it's kind of stopping people. People are not very sure which direction should we go. Should we do more of the same little inventions, or is it worth at all? Are we going to do anything with these outcomes, or are we just doing theoretical exercises that nobody is going to believe? I still think there's a lot of important messages in the type of work that we do, but I don't think that we should go to the details of planning a particular system. Anyway, despite all the uncertainty I've been talking about, I think that this is no reason for inaction, and I think that we have enough knowledge to start being more proactive into accounting for climate change, or at least being aware of it, having more adaptive management in place. But importantly, I think it's not enough to look into changes in temperature and precipitation, and we should be looking at changes incurred by climate change that come through land cover changes in other sectors. So I think that with that, I finish. Thanks for your attention.